thank you all, and I hesitate to mention people by name because I know there are other people behind the scenes who are working on arrangements at the university. Please, everyone who has been associated with this lecture, you have my thanks, and no more so than Professor Bogdanow, who had the wit to endow this lectureship. I commend you here at the University of Manchester for receiving this donation and for preceding me with my wonderful friend and colleague, Christopher Browning. You're off to a wonderful start, and I only hope I can live up to my friend Chris Browning's lecture to you all last year. So chapeau to the University of Manchester and for the Center for Jewish Studies and the Department of History and whoever else was involved. I really do appreciate it. This lecture is about my new book. I am still filled with it in a way. It was published just a few weeks ago, and we had an event at the University of Toronto just a few days ago in which several colleagues, one patched in via Skype, discussed this book with me. Well, I appreciate the opportunity. This is the first opportunity, in fact, to talk about this work to a public audience. So please feed back. I'm very interested in reactions. And I'm very interested as well in my own getting over this book, frankly. And as I do so, I want to begin this lecture with a quotation that I love about finishing books. I have a feeling it will be known to some of the people here, dare I say some of the older people, but I see a fair number of students. I'm not sure if many of you have heard it, but in my experience, younger students or students may not have. It's Winston Churchill's observation about finishing books, and he knew a thing or two about finishing books. What he said was, writing a book, do you know the quotation? Writing a book is an adventure. To begin with, it's a toy and an amusement. And then it becomes a mistress. And then it becomes a master. And then it becomes a tyrant. And the last phase is that just as you are about to be reconciled to your servitude, you kill the monster and fling it about to the public. Well, this is the flinging stage, ladies and gentlemen. Let me say also that my book is 200 pages. It's partly a memoir and partly a critique of the idea of lessons. It is not a monster, although, let's say, it's not a monster for you. But it was a monster for me, as my wife will attest, I think. And I'm glad it's done. Now it's yours to judge, to assess, to criticize, to read, not to read, or whatever. So that expresses my own mood. I don't want to leave it at that, because Churchill said something else, which really goes, I think, to the heart of this book. As I said, it's partly a memoir, but partly also a critique of the whole idea of lessons. And in that sense, I think it swims against the stream, swims against the tide. Churchill had a real challenge in the House of Commons in 1940 with the death of Chamberlain. Neville Chamberlain died. Churchill rose in the House of Commons, and as you may know, he was a very magnanimous person, and he wanted to say some good things about Chamberlain, but of course Chamberlain had been wrong about the big question, wrong about the recent historical past. And so he had to deal with this. It was the obvious issue. How would he deal with it? Well, he said, he said it. Chamberlain got it wrong. But we all get it wrong in some respects. It's very hard to draw lessons from history. I'm not speaking in Churchillian prose, but now I am. He said about history, listen to what he said, "History, with its flickering lamp, stumbles along the trail of the past, trying to reconstruct its scenes, to revive its echoes and kindle with pale gleams the passions of former days." What is the worth of all this? The only guide to a man is his conscience. The only shield to his memory is the rectitude and sincerity of his actions, and thereby his compliment to his predecessor, Neville Chamberlain. I think it's a brilliant observation. I won't talk about it more, or much more, but you'll see what I mean. I mean, he's saying that, you know, it isn't the whole story to have predicted. Okay, he couldn't predict, but who can predict? But you know, what really counts is how much of himself was in the story and what the story meant to him and what we might derive from the story. I'll come back to these things. The second quotation also touches the theme of my book when it talks about the frailty of our capacity to learn from history, and in particular, the tortuous ways in which we try to formulate lessons of history. Or I shouldn't say tortuous, no, that's wrong. It's difficult to formulate those lessons, and we so often get it wrong, but people so often fail to have the humility to realize that they are getting it wrong or that they have got it wrong. I'll come back to that. Let me start my discussion of the lessons of history by stepping back from that subject, lessons of the Holocaust, by stepping back from that subject just a bit and thinking about the wider context. It's what I said, the lessons of history, not so much the lessons of the Holocaust. Such lessons are, I believe, part of the general community's assumption of what Holocaust history is all about. When I say to people that I am working on the Holocaust, frequently there is a pause, a kind of respectful hush about which I feel quite embarrassed. And then they often say, well, don't we really know all we need to know about the Holocaust? Isn't this a sort of morbid sensibility that you have? And furthermore, isn't it your job to articulate the lessons of the Holocaust? Why are you spending all of this time with your students and with your colleagues doing academic type work? Shouldn't it be your job, and isn't it the purpose, and shouldn't it be the objective of Holocaust history to produce these lessons so that such things can never happen again? That is, in a nutshell, what I think is the public discourse, the public rhetoric about Holocaust history. We don't say that about other kinds of history, but we do say it about the Holocaust. So a few words now while I inquire and investigate the subject of the lessons of history, and then I'll get to the lessons of the Holocaust. Now, over the years, thinkers have hardly been unanimous in considering whether the lessons of history actually exist. During the Enlightenment, some thought deeply about this question because of the radical religious implications of this question. Some worried then that if people were to use the past to control how things unfolded, this precluded divine planning or challenged divine planning or intervention. Indeed, as late as a century and a half ago, the idea of human agency in shaping historical events was something of a novelty. and a contention that was sharply disputed. Many in the pre-modern era continued to believe that the course of history was set by divine providence and that individuals could do little to affect particular outcomes. But during this time, others thought to formulate a non-theological notion of history in which people could shape the course of history independently of divine intervention. Many came to believe that one way of doing so was to understand and to apply the lessons of the past. And serious debate turned on how to do this, and whether human agency operated with a clean slate or with fixed parameters. In one tradition, intellectuals invested great energy in delineating predetermined directions of history and speculating about the patterns that they discerned. During the 19th and 20th centuries, writers such as Oswald Spengler or Arnold Toynbee charted the rise and fall of empires and regimes, examining the cycles that they follow or the trajectories that they traversed, often in competition with one another. One of the purposes for constructing these schemes was that people could thereby learn where things were headed, that is, what the future held in store. Other thinkers despaired entirely of being able to deduce any patterns at all. To them, grand visions were mythical constructs, and so also were claims that one could tease out lessons from what has gone before. Their thoughts on history, history with a capital H, could be unpretentiously short, much as those of the great theorists were grand and portentous. Pressed at the end of his days to tell the world what he understood to be the lessons of history, the great polymath and visionary Aldous Huxley responded with a disarming, humane simplicity. What did he say? It's a bit embarrassing to have been concerned with the human problem all one's life and to find at the end one has no more to offer than try to be a little bit kinder. Huxley's comment has a disarming, appealing character. Perhaps we are relieved at the thought that what is asked of us may be simpler than we feared, and that we need not bother to chart the rise and fall of civilization because it doesn't matter, or it's wrong. Similarly appealing may be the conclusions of the Israeli statesman Abba Eban, who once observed, "History teaches us that men and nations behave wisely once they have exhausted all the other alternatives." We like to hear that even the great and famous may lose their way, just like us, or perhaps more accurately, that there is no way to lose. One pertinent issue that this situation imposes for my subject is that, in the academy at least, lessons of history have gone out of style. Nobody articulates lessons of history at universities these days. If I were to pronounce in the corridors of the Department of History at the University of Toronto my latest findings on the lessons of history, I might be considered hopelessly old-fashioned or perhaps even dangerously eccentric. My critics, moreover, would enlist powerful historical voices to show how foolish I was to even believe in such things. Michael Howard, the British military historian, spoke about this subject years ago when he was named Regius Professor of History at Oxford. As he explained in a public lecture at the time, there was really no such thing as history as a body of truths comprising what really happened. Instead, and I quote him, "History is what historians write, and historians are part of the process they are writing about," unquote. Moreover, the interesting thing is that new evidence constantly appears. This is Howard again. New evidence constantly appears, and even more importantly, the shape of history changes with shifts in the historian's mentality and what he or she happens to be interested in. And so what is known as history is continuously evolving and continuously being written about. And that's why we should never assume that we will ever settle definitively what really happened, and why the history on which the lessons supposedly rest constantly changes as new perspectives emerge, new questions are put to the evidence, and new imaginations are enlisted in the effort to understand the past. Historians know these things well, Howard suggested, for armies of their successors are constantly and openly assembling, and historians know better than most that revisions of their favorite theories and descriptions are only a matter of time, only a matter of time. Regrettably for the professors, Howard suggested, lay readers seldom get this. Indeed, this time-limited approach for the lay person is maddening. They want, that is, lay readers generally want, the past to be firmly fixed in place. The layman, Howard continued, and I quote him, looks for wise teachers who will use their knowledge of the past to explain the present and guide the future. That's what they expect. But what do they find? They find workmen, that is, the historians, busily engaged in tearing up what the layperson had regarded as a perfectly decent highway, doing their best to discourage him from proceeding along it at all, and warning him that if he does proceed along, that the surface is temporary, that they have no idea when it will be completed or where it leads, and that he proceeds at his own risk. Well, for those who agree with Michael Howard, and I rather do, the Spanish-American philosopher George Santayana, who I bet many of you have been anticipating will be brought into this discussion. George Santayana, you know, who wrote that those who cannot remember history are doomed to repeat it. Well, you know, in many quarters, this dictum has been almost treated as a Holocaust lesson in its own right. But in fact, if you follow Howard's critique, of course, there is no guidance to be found in history. Indeed, when you look at what Santayana said carefully, he talked about remembering the past, not studying or acquiring knowledge about the past. I'll continue with that, and perhaps we can discuss it in our question time. But do note that there is a notion here widely held, not by professional historians but by lay people, that history has spoken, and it is our job to listen to what she said. Or, put differently, we ignore what she said at our peril. But what does she say? And does the fact that remembering is a highly subjective and uncertain exercise, does this really mean that we should rely upon the remembrance of the past? Well, when you think about it, this critique falls back on not discovery, but interpretation. We interpret the past, and we interpret it differently. People do not come up with the same observations about the past because they interpret it differently. A final point. All of this is my introduction to the difficulties that we have, or should have, I think, with Holocaust history, is that examining lessons used to be drawn from the past, reminds us of how, with the best of intentions, our predecessors erred, missing the right cues or shrinking from responses that were thought unpalatable. Let me give an example. Some of this is a little abstract. One concrete example. Geoffrey Elton, the most famous Tudor historian of his day. He once provided a striking example of this process of lessons. To someone of Elton's background and generation, you know, he was born in 1921, Geoffrey Elton, into a family of Jewish scholars named Ehrenberg, who fled to Britain from Germany in 1939. Now, to someone of Elton's background, no historical issue was more important than the warlike predominance of Prussia and then Germany on the European continent. But in his reflections on the historical past, Elton meditated on that little dangerous phrase, learning from the past. If you learn from the past superficially, you would say, as so many of my colleagues and I did when we were studying history by then in the 1960s, you know, those Germans, you've got to watch them. We learn from the past. But listen to what Elton said. Owing to 2 world wars largely unleashed by imperialist ambitions entertained by successive German governments, and by the way, he wrote this after the Second World War, it is now widely felt that the resurgence of Germany once again threatens the peace of the world. But if you go back to 1870, Germany was united under the leadership of that nowadays notoriously warlike country, Prussia. The common reaction was very different. That event came after 2 centuries of almost uninterrupted aggression from France. And German unification came about as a result of a victorious war against that established disturber of the peace. It was France that was considered the great disturber of the European peace. And therefore, at that time, and for some time afterwards, the unification of Germany was very widely regarded, at least outside France, as a most fortunate event, and Bismarck, later converted into a menace, received much praise and admiration. Ladies and gentlemen, I think you see my point. With the passage of time, some lessons lose their salience, and new lessons appear. And as history becomes more of an international undertaking, interpretations that have standing in some societies make more or less no sense in other societies. And as historians turn their imaginations to other questions about the past, new understandings of it emerge. That is why, to many observers, what emerges strikingly from history is our inability to predict. Our inability to predict. What can history teach us? Asks the eminent French thinker Jacques Ellul. And then he said, only the vanity of believing that we can impose our own theories on history. Now, despite these words of wisdom, and despite the disappearance of lessons of history from most professional historical agendas, the call to heed the lessons of the Holocaust remain not only alive and well, but powerfully present in communal discourse. And I cannot overstress how common, particularly outside the academy, is the view that these lessons are what one learns from studying the Holocaust. By such lessons, people are referring, and I want to be careful about this, people are referring to admonitions that are drawn from contemplations of Holocaust history. Those of this persuasion consider such lessons to be timeless injunctions that are deduced from what happened to European Jews during the Second World War. And these injunctions, it is believed, should direct the conduct of individuals and their societies. References to the lessons of the Holocaust are regularly found in commemorative ceremonies, mission statements, and summations of popular wisdom. Identifying them is enjoined by popular writers, teachers, philosophers, after-dinner speakers, presidents, prime ministers, ministers, broadcasters, clergymen, and fundraisers. And not only do people still refer to lessons as one of the objects of historical inquiry about the wartime murder of European Jews, it is usually proclaimed that whenever people do this, they are serving the public good. Moreover, some believe that if we can identify the correct lessons, we will be preventing such things from happening again. Many march under the banner of Never Again, a slogan popularized, by the way, by the ultra-right-wing Meir Kahane, a founder of the fringe Israeli party Kach, and widely condemned as a racist in Israel today. So, how widespread is this phenomenon? Let me give just one example from my favorite source, Google. Do you know what you get when you type in lessons of the Holocaust into Google? In early November, when I last tried this, and that's without quotation marks, the answer was 10,500,000 in 0.48 seconds. Now, they can't all be right, by the way, and it is impossible for anyone fully to, I think, encompass in their studies what these lessons point to, whether they change over time, whether they vary by country, by culture. The main point I want to stress is that there is no end of problems if you really want to find out about lessons. No end of problems. At the most basic level, I doubt if anyone could really even summarize these lessons of the Holocaust. You know, there are left-wing lessons and right-wing lessons. There are lessons that are generated in Eastern Europe and lessons that are generated in Western Europe. There are lessons that are developed and written about by Jews. There are lessons that are written about by non-Jews. My colleague, historian Margaret Macmillan, warns that, I quote her, "There are many lessons and much advice offered by history, and it's easy to pick and choose which ones you want. The great multitude of lessons out there suggests that many, in fact, cancel each other out. I mean, are there right-wing lessons and left-wing lessons, and both are applicable and both are true, etc. They're all over the map as well, as I indicated, and the latest that I read was in Timothy Snyder's latest book on the Holocaust, in which Timothy Snyder, swimming against the whole tide up to now, in recent times at least, and Timothy Snyder knows exactly what he's doing. This is the historian at Yale, wrote a very controversial book, and he said, the lesson of the Holocaust is that states protect the Jews, and when states disintegrate, the Jews are vulnerable and can be murdered. And he claims that he's a smart fellow, famous historian, wrote many books, some of which are full of, received wonderful reviews. Zionist arguments, they have figured very importantly in this debate, with many people ascribing the vulnerability of the wartime Jewish populations to an absence of a Jewish state in the 1930s. Well, there's possibly some truth in this. You know, if there had been a Jewish state, some Jews might not have been murdered. But there's a powerful argument, and I got this from Israeli historians, and in particular, one of the most distinguished, Yehuda Bauer, that says exactly the opposite. I'll tell you, mention briefly Bauer's argument because he was involved in this. The time is 1942, the autumn of 1942. The Yishuv has about 500,000 Jews. Rommel's armies are doing spectacularly in North Africa. And then, suddenly, they're stopped at the Second Battle of El Alamein. But what if they had not been stopped? What if the British had not had the signals intelligence that enabled them to decode the German communications? And what if Montgomery's armies had been swept aside and the Germans had gone into Egypt and then to Palestine? You know, they had, two German scholars have written about this fairly recently. The Germans had a special unit that was preparing a kind of Einsatzgruppen attack on the Jews in Palestine. And Jews in Palestine, those who were conscious of what was going on in the war, believed that that would happen. And there was a plan known as the Carmel Plan, in which the Jews would harass the German troops, but it would be a suicidal last stand. They would go to Mount Carmel, and Yehuda, who was 16 years old, with his father, went to Mount Carmel, and they expect it would be a last stand for the Jews of Palestine. So what is there a lesson here? Well, perhaps we can discuss what that lesson might be, but Yehuda now says, he writes an endorsement of my book, so I shouldn't implicate him further, but he believes that it's impossible to draw a lesson from this. So let me go back now to my argument and put the question to you: how can you explain the constant invocation of lessons of the Holocaust? We don't constantly invoke the lessons of the French Revolution or the lessons of the Russian Revolution, do we? Or, I don't know, the lesson of any other important historical event. We study history differently, and that's what I'm approaching in this talk. We study history differently. So I want to go on and explain why I think there is this appreciation, but let me clarify my stand, make it for you, and open myself then to criticism that I'm sure some have. I believe that when speaking about the Holocaust, and I have done it now for 30 plus years, the obligation, the duty that we have is to be as faithful as we possibly can be to the events from which the statements about that catastrophic event are developed. There's something fundamentally wrong, I believe, to use the Holocaust so casually as a source of validation of our various theories, as a means by which we seek special authority for courses of action for which we are looking for support and approval. As acknowledgement of the significance of the Holocaust has increased globally, an unfortunate accompaniment has been a loss of respect for detailed knowledge of what actually did happen. And I frankly have seen too much of this. And so my principal lesson of the Holocaust is beware of lessons. Now, it'll take me a bit of time, but I will talk about what I think one does learn from it. But I want to answer my previous question, or at least attempt to do so beforehand, and that is to return to the question of why. Why do we invoke lessons? I believe that this preoccupation has to do with our continuing difficulty in coming to terms with this historically precedent-shattering event. The American writer Susan Jacoby argues that the search for Holocaust lessons may even have a religious origin. And I quote her, "The idea that there are some sort of general moral lessons to be derived from the Holocaust is rooted in the religious concept that something good must come out of something bad, that everything, however terrible, is part of a greater plan wrought by an intelligent designer. Otherwise, how could anyone justify continuing to believe in a benevolent supreme being after such a cataclysm?" Put differently, I think part of the explanation of the appeal of lessons is a quest for redemptive outcomes, which are quite, I think, not always conscious, but are quite evident in a lot of writing about the Holocaust. The quest for redemptive outcomes. It's hardly surprising that this suggests itself to those who study the Holocaust. Its subject matter is so ghastly that there is a very human pull, I think, to find some positive answer to the question of why we are drawn to study this material. In this last part of my discussion now, I want to go through some commonly expressed lessons of the Holocaust in order to examine how things go wrong, in my opinion, when good intentions are turned into lessons. In the blizzard of lessons out there, many appear as slogans such as Kahani's Never Again, or a much more benign, here's one, we are each the guardians of each other's destiny, or Jews are like the canary in the coal mine, or these are admirable thoughts, each in its way, although not necessarily derivative of the Holocaust or illuminated by a close study of its events. I hope you see my point. In practice, all kinds of people dip into the Holocaust for direction. Well-meaning, I don't deny it, at least for the most part, although perhaps not always. Learned in some cases, opportunistic in others, defining all kinds of propositions as lessons, many of them quite different, and some of them actually in opposition to others, and all of them questionable in my opinion. If the study of history does nothing more than to teach us humility, skepticism, and awareness of ourselves, then it has done something useful. That's an observation of Margaret Macmillan, to which I can only say, Amen. Have I been too abstract in talking about these lessons? I think perhaps I have, but in order to close with a bit more concreteness, I want to refer to some widely repeated lessons taken from my book in an effort to show both their widespread variability and also what I believe to be their derivative character, that is, the way in which these lessons really speak to what we would like the Holocaust to be telling us rather than what we might understand as deriving from a close study of the events themselves. So let me give a few of these examples. I will try to be brief, and then we can perhaps discuss this. What about the idea of the Holocaust as a school for tolerance? Have you heard about it? Of course you have. Probably it's the most commonly articulated lesson of the Holocaust in North America and Western Europe at least, and now in Russia, where they have built a museum that carries this message. But the most famous of the museums is that of the, that is to convey this lesson, is that of the Simon Wiesenthal Center. They have a museum of tolerance in Los Angeles in which a main exhibition on the Holocaust is accompanied by a tolerance center where, and I quote from their website, visitors focus on the major issues of intolerance that are part of daily life. Now, I have no quarrel with admonitions to be tolerant. I walked around Manchester this morning, and I saw in these blue and white banners that hang on the municipal building, "Be tolerant." Yes, where do I sign on? But this is not, I believe, a lesson of the Holocaust. To the historian, the idea that the Holocaust was about intolerance or prejudice, this would be laughable if it were not a serious matter maintained seriously by men and women of obvious goodwill. Let's be clear. People in history have forever been intolerant or prejudiced by our 21st century North American or European definitions without necessarily slaughtering each other and committing genocide in a manner that practically defies belief. The Holocaust is not about tolerance, it's about mass killing. That's what it's about. And mass killing on a continental scale. People have always been intolerant, but that doesn't mean that they enter into a campaign of continent-wide genocide. Throughout history, societies have commonly stigmatized, exploited, brutalized, punished, and persecuted groups and individuals, or even worse, without slaughtering them so obsessively or seeking to wipe them off the face of the earth. An important question about the Holocaust is why and how the barriers that obtained in those previous societies, barriers of law and custom and religion and economics and whatever, why they seem to have collapsed under the Third Reich, and how the Germans managed to organize killing on such a vast scale. Narrowing the Holocaust to an issue of intolerance and prejudice not only prompts a misunderstanding of such wrongdoing in our world today, it misstates the significance of the event, the authority of which we are then borrowing so disrespectfully. Let me just cite a couple of more lessons before I stop. What about, and I'm sure you've heard this too, all it takes for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing. Have you heard this before? I've heard it hundreds of times. Among the most popular of Holocaust lessons, this statement blends good intentions with popular cliches. Just as there are few who would champion hate speech, there are few who believe that good men should do nothing. But all it takes? In any assessment of the rise of Nazism or the Holocaust, it would be an outrageous misstatement to claim that good men did nothing to oppose Nazism, or even, for that matter, to resist the Germans carrying out the final solution. Of course, there were too few. Of course, they came too late, as so often is the case. Of course, without sufficient energy. It may be, however, presumptuous of us to say so. But all it takes? Did nothing? These are bits of slogans, hardly constituting a serious assessment. Worse still, promoting them as a lesson suggests that if good men would only act responsibly, all might be well. This is not only a childishly simple view of how genocide functions, it also slights the resistance that did occur, sometimes secretly or silently, to no effect whatever. One more, I think one final one. One person can make a difference. Have you heard that one? One person can make a difference. Now, like the other lessons, they're in the service of good intentions. The idea that every individual but the idea that every individual has the capacity to thwart in some way the evils of a state like Nazi Germany, that's a notion that would be properly scorned by any who actually had to face Nazism's unrelenting power. Arguably, the history of daily lives of Jews under Nazism suggests precisely the opposite. How even the most resourceful, the bravest, those who were willing to hurl themselves against the machinery of destruction, more often than not failed even to slow the killing process. Coming from a religious discourse that may celebrate acts of goodness wherever they appear, this claim has more to do, I believe, with our hunger for redemptive messages than anything else. And there are some cruel implications of this lesson. One of them is that ordinary people ought to have had a clearer sense of what they were facing, or more courage in dealing with it, or that bystanders ought to have acted more forcefully. But the slightest effort at comparison suggests how fanciful is this idea. Peter Hayes points rightly to the case of the Soviet prisoners of war who perished at such staggering rates and numbers. And these were young men with military training and fighting experience, of whom close to 3.5 million, almost 60% of those captured, succumbed to starvation, abuse, and outright massacre. The contest was so uneven, this is the contest with Nazism, was so uneven that it is cruel to the memory of the victims to talk about how much they could have gummed up the German operations if only they had been less cooperative. That's Peter Hayes. It may gratify us to identify heroes who sacrificed themselves and who became martyrs to a good cause. We may well choose to identify them as examples. Fair enough. But formulating such cases as lessons of the Holocaust obscures the historical reality of wartime genocide and falsifies the situation that bystanders actually faced. So let me conclude. Summing up the lessons of the Holocaust I've discussed in this lecture, I want to clarify some limits of my critique. My quarrel is not necessarily with the probity of any of these lessons, of any of the purported lessons as various people have drawn them. Some of these lessons may be significant, some of them quite trivial, some may be quite true, many are valuable as admonitions, and people who advance them are often very well-intentioned, even exemplary. But when I hear, as I do, again, from the pens and from the descriptions of people who are very well-meaning, that what we learn from the Holocaust is that there should be no bullying of students in the playground. This is trivialization. This is not derived from the Holocaust. And I am contesting the use of the Holocaust to make this very good case. Don't bully your fellow student in the schoolyard. So, my problem with such formula, and I really am going to conclude now, my problem with such formula is that they generally do not depend upon the Holocaust for their veracity, nor are they necessarily true in every respect, nor should they need or rest upon the Holocaust as a source of validation. Nor are they always a guide to modern-day challenges, and nor do they necessarily follow from an understanding of the Holocaust that is undertaken by Holocaust historians. Most of them say more about those who dreamed them up than about the murder of European Jews. And finally, nor do they derive from what I think should be the first responsibility of Holocaust educators and researchers, and that is to get the history right, which is to say, to be faithful to the event from which the lesson is claimed to derive. And that, I suggest, is the first test for anyone who claims to speak with authority about this subject. That is to say, to be as true as we possibly can be to the facts and the circumstances of the Holocaust, and to seek as deep and sophisticated and independent-minded an understanding of these events as we can manage. This is the theme about which I will speak in my lecture tomorrow. Thank you very much for listening to me.